to fund Ukraine's government with an interest-free loan for the next 2 years. Kyiv is running out of cash and will soon be going into year 5 of the full-scale invasion. The loan will help keep it afloat. However, the European Council did not use some 210 billion euros worth of Russian assets mostly held in Belgium. Belgium's Prime Minister, Bart de Wever, has strongly opposed the plan, as had Moscow, Washington, and a number of other EU member states, notably Italy. Now I'll be discussing the summit with Dave Keating, who writes the Gulf Stream Blues newsletter. He's a Brussels-based correspondent who focuses on European politics, and he's also the author of a new book called The Own Continent. So, Dave, were you at the council yesterday? When did you get home?
It was a very, very late night. That basically my wrap up and my TV appearance and my Substack what came out was 6 this morning. So it was a late one, but like I just took a little nap. So now I'm super refreshed, as you can tell. It was a long summit. It reminded me of some of those Eurozone crisis summits I used to cover back in 2010, 2011, 2012. But this time, it was a legitimate disagreement. Back then, you always had the impression that, okay, they actually figured out what they're doing, but they're staying here really late for no reason, just to look like they're burning the midnight oil and taking everything very seriously for the benefit of the markets. But no markets this time. So I think this was actually just legitimate disagreement. So I think this is a good news and bad news outcome for the European Union. And looking back at my Substack post that I wrote this morning at 6 a.m., maybe I was a little tired and cranky because I think I mostly focused on the negative aspects. But I'd like to talk now about the positive aspects because there are some, and I think those were less apparent to me at 6 in the morning. There's a good outcome here for the European Union itself. Also for Ukraine, less so. But the optics are terrible. So the optics outcome is really, really bad because the EU said it was going to do this thing, use frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine. We had all this messaging from President von der Leyen, Chancellor Merz, saying this is essential. We must do this for Ukraine. And then they didn't. So it looks really bad. Now, what they've agreed instead, this plan B, is a huge step. And it's something that traditionally used to attract huge opposition from Northern Europe and didn't that time. If you're a European federalist, this is actually very good news. But let's talk about that later. Let's talk about the bad optics first, because it's really bad. So the disagreement here was about these frozen Russian assets, most of which, but not all, are here in Belgium at the Euroclear clearinghouse. There's a total of 210 billion euros of Russian money held in banks around the European Union. 140 billion of those euros are here in Belgium. And the Belgian Prime Minister, Bart de Wever, was worried about legal repercussions down the line if they took this money and gave it to Ukraine. This is something that had been suggested for the past 2 years. You would hear this idea of using the Russian assets. But we were always told by the Commission, by the national governments, no, that's really pie in the sky. I know it might seem easy to you, but it's really complicated. And it also would seem to undermine the very rules-based order that we're trying to protect. So that's completely off the table. What changed is when the United States pulled its funding for Ukraine. What changed is Donald Trump coming into office, pulling support for Ukraine. You then had this money being talked about as a way to give Europe a seat at the table, since the Trump administration was ignoring Europe in these peace process efforts. And so you had heard this, okay, let's put the frozen Russian assets on the table here to get us a seat at the table. So Europe can say, let us into the talks or else you're not going to get this money that we have. But lately, it became clear that actually this was no longer about political signaling. This was about the money itself, because Ukraine was going to run out of money in April. So the EU had to give them the money somehow. Back in October at the last European Council summit, they agreed, we will get Ukraine this money somehow. Ukraine will not run out of money. We'll revisit this at the December European Council because Bart de Wever was still objecting. And then they had to do something, and that's why they came up with Plan B. Otherwise, they were going to be here till Saturday. That was made very clear by the council chair, Antonio Costa. The reasons for Bart de Wever's objections are, let's say, some are legitimate and some look a little suspect. So originally, when they decided to change their thinking on these frozen assets, Bart de Wever said, no, this is really complicated. Belgium can't take this risk on. We need to talk about this. He was at first ignored by the Commission, by all accounts, treated very rudely by Commission President von der Leyen and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who were basically ignoring his concerns. After a while, he made it clear, I'm not fucking around. You need to give me cast iron guarantees that the risk for this will not be borne just by Belgian taxpayers, but by all EU taxpayers. If Russia was eventually able to mount a successful legal challenge to this, he wanted an unlimited guarantee for that the EU or the other EU countries would pay the bill. Friedrich Merz didn't like the idea of a blank check given to Belgium, and so he was really resisting that. This got less coverage, I think, particularly in German media, but this was really a case of De Wever against Merz, and Merz was being, I think, a bit obstinate in that. But this goes back to the Eurozone days. Anytime you're talking about a blank check being asked for by a Catholic European country, you get pushback from the Protestant European countries. I know it sounds maybe oversimplistic, but I'm a student of European history, and history certainly rhymes. Anyway, all of that is just to say that's where Bart de Wever was coming from. But the EU did offer a lot of guarantees here to spread out this debt, especially in the last days. But de Wever kept saying no. He kept not moving. And that's when suspicion started that this was not actually about technical or legal issues. This was about something else. Now, we know that other political leaders in Belgium have been intimidated by Russia. There's been a lot of stories about this, also the leaders of Euroclear, the executives. But we also have had reporting from Bloomberg, from Politico, that Washington was leaning on him very heavily because if they went ahead with this, it would scupper the US's peace plan, which relies on that frozen assets money going to the US so they can use it to rebuild Ukraine and profit from that reconstruction. If you took that out of the peace plan, it removes a major component, and the Americans were saying the peace plan will fail if the EU takes these frozen Russian assets. Really, I think they were looking for an excuse for why the peace plan inevitably is going to fail. But anyway, they were getting leaned on heavily. Then Giorgia Meloni from Italy, you mentioned that she signed on to De Wever's position here. That was quite a surprise. It came at the end of last week. Italy, along with Bulgaria, Malta, and Belgium, joined Belgium's position, objecting to the use of frozen assets and saying we should consider joint EU debt to support Ukraine instead. Why that sudden turn? I think, and a lot of other people think, it has to do with Washington's pressure on Rome and Brussels. Both De Wever and Meloni are from the hard right European conservatives and reformist group. That group, they're the only two prime ministers from that group in the European Council. That group styles itself as the great ally of the Trump administration in Europe. It's no mystery why it was Meloni that came to De Wever's aid. And I think that were it not for Meloni's support, De Wever would have buckled last night. He would have said yes. But he had the support of Italy, a major, large founding member of the European Union. And so he didn't buckle. He had her backing. So were it not for Meloni, I think we would have frozen Russian assets going to Ukraine right now. That has a lot of implications for the future of the European Union, for where the EU is going. But all of that is a long explanation to say that's why we ended up where we did last night. So De Wever won, Meloni won, Friedrich Merz lost. He was saying he absolutely would not accept this common debt. We can go into later why.
Yeah.
President von der Leyen lost because she said, no, this is the main option. This is what we're going with. In the US and Russia, I think you could say won.
I guess I would push back on the notion that I mean, I don't know about the U.S. I don't really know where their interests are right now. It depends on the day, but it seems like that Russia would have wanted Ukraine to get zero, and now Ukraine has 90 billion over the next 2 years to fund its military, to fund its government, to pay teachers and civil servants. And without it, they would have been like really screwed. And, now they have the money and they're in the game at least. So like for me, it doesn't like, I know Putin's crowing about how he, got the Russian assets off the table. And like, of course he's saying that, but on the other hand, like this is real money and it will you know, perhaps avoid Kiev from having to take like the worst Trump deal on the table, the last one of which we know for certain was this, 28-point plan that was leaked to the press last month. I'd also add that, the assets are still frozen and Kiev doesn't have to pay back this money unless Russia makes reparations. So they could still use the assets, at some later date, in theory, if Russia doesn't make reparations. So, it's still a possibility. But I wanted to ask
Can I
you
just
another
jump in
question.
on that real
Yeah,
quick?
sure.
So I absolutely agree. That's why I say I think it's a good news, bad news story. This is not a
Yeah,
complete win for Russia, but it's kind of a moral victory because again, the optics don't look good here. The EU
yeah,
said it was going to do something to support Ukraine, and then it didn't. I mean, in terms of 90 billion euros coming out over the next months, that's the same schedule of payment that they had landed on for the frozen Russian assets because they were going to time out the payments again to
right,
reassure Belgium that there would be some money left out of the fund itself if Russia had a successful legal challenge. So monetarily, Ukraine is basically getting the same in the next months that it would have gotten under the other plan. The issue is this exposed so much EU division. Uh,
right,
this looks very much now like Brussels, as the national capital, and Rome are in the pocket of Putin, or at least that's how Russia is going to want to portray this. The shame is here. The EU never likes to put things to a vote if it knows it's going to lose because
right.
it
You would never do that.
fit
Yeah,
because
yeah,
it exposes disunity. So I think there's a Politico piece I saw yesterday that really walked through the failures of Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in this because she really failed to read the room and she failed to gauge the intensity of De Wever's opposition and the support for that opposition here in Belgium. I don't know any Belgian who does not support what De Wever has been doing the past days. Everyone I
really.
talked
They
to,
don't
yes,
support Ukraine.
it's not that they don't support Ukraine, but they wanted to go with Plan B. So they're saying,
I
what's wrong
see.
with Plan B? What's wrong with the collective debt? Why is Friedrich Merz blocking the collective debt? That's the much simpler option. It's the much better option. And I, as a Belgian taxpayer, again, I'm speaking for the other people, not me, even though I am a Belgian taxpayer.
Yeah,
I, as a Belgian taxpayer, don't want to be on the hook for this. So yeah, everyone I talked to here, and public polling was revealing that as well. So I think this is the problem is this is a bit of a moral victory, even though the money is still going to Ukraine in the same way that it would have under the frozen assets plan.
okay. So let's talk about Viktor Orban. I mean, did the EU successfully sideline him and Hungary and Slovakia? Because the argument before was that they couldn't do this without unanimity. And lo and behold, they found a way to do it. I mean, it struck me that in your answer about uh, the Russian frozen assets is earlier the debate was like, oh, this can't be done, this is impossible. And then it seems like earlier in previous weeks they had been saying, joint debt can only be done with unanimity, and Hungary and Slovakia are going to veto it. And then just at the 11th hour, they found a way to do it. And I don't think it's worth getting into the legal or sort of technical aspects of that, but it does seem like that they were able to sideline him. Do you think that his influence, is much less than meets the eye? Maybe.
This was definitely a defeat for Viktor Orban, for sure, because he came into that summit yesterday morning saying absolutely no, he will veto the use of collective debt to fund Ukraine. And he said he would do that whether or not Hungary had to pay, because for him, this was an issue of principle. If you continue to give Ukraine money, the war continues. You give Ukraine false hope, he would say, because Ukraine is inevitably going to lose this war. So more people die in the meantime. So this wasn't really about protecting the Hungarian taxpayer, and he never said it was. He said it was about his moral opposition to continuing this war. You can feel however you want to about that reasoning, but that's what he said. And then he did something totally different. So, of course, Hungary and his allies, his pro-Russian allies in Slovakia and Czechia, just Babiš and Robert Fico in Slovakia, are exempt from this, so they will not be part of this collective borrowing. So he did get that, but this is the opposite of what he said he was going to do. And it's interesting because just as recently as Wednesday, ahead of these European Council summits, the permanent representatives, these are the people who represent the national governments permanently here in Brussels, they always give briefings to journalists. And I heard in briefing after briefing after briefing on Wednesday that Plan B is unworkable because it requires unanimity and Viktor Orban will veto. Full stop. I didn't
Yeah.
hear a single person say, maybe we can convince him to relent on his veto. The assumption was when it comes to Ukraine, these are always votes of 26, and so we can't do anything that requires unanimity. They were even talking about possible Article 122 workarounds where they could not do unanimity on this. The one EU official told me that the council and the commission legal services had told them Wednesday morning that that was not possible, that even though they used this weird clause in the treaties to overrule unanimity requirements for the freezing of Russian assets, it was impossible to do with this because it's something to do with the budget. And then all of a sudden, this scenario happens at 3 in the morning last night. I'm not kidding that not a single person in this town floated that as a possibility. So what changed? What happened? We don't really have a clear answer about why Viktor Orban relented.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible. I mean, one idea is that maybe he got what he wanted. Maybe I think there might be some side deal probably here, but in the sense he got sort of what he wanted, in that he doesn't have to pay for this. So that's one thing that he can take back. And
But I think he was not,
he's
this solution was always going to be this. Like he never was going to have to pay for that. That's for
right,
sure.
right,
So this, what they gave him would have been the starting point. So I just
yeah,
wonder what came between that starting point and when he actually said, yes, whatever it is, we have not been told to the public.
yeah, yeah. Very interesting. Um, So, like, let's talk about this seat at the table question. Like, the European Union was saying, I think, pretty explicitly that the frozen asset loan would be a seat at the table at these peace talks between, the United States and Russia and Ukrainian officials. Do you think this loan gives them a seat at the table now?
No, because the US doesn't want to continue this war. The US does not want funding going to Ukraine while the war is going on because it gives Ukraine the confidence to not accept a surrender deal. So I think that reasoning was always a bit flawed because but when the European Union had that reasoning, they had managed to convince themselves that Trump wanted to support Ukraine or could be
Right,
convinced to support Ukraine. It is now very, very clear Trump just wants to end this war. He sees the only way of ending this war as Ukraine surrendering. So continuing to send money or weapons to Ukraine, it gets in the way of the peace plan that the administration is trying to pursue. So now, yes, I mean, like you say, the frozen assets are still there on the table, although I really think it's clear that they can't use them, that they don't have the political will, the political capital to use those frozen assets. So it's kind of a defanged gun, if that's not a mixed metaphor. Yeah, it's still there, but they've shown the world that they can't actually use it because they can't get the political agreement. So that's really off the table. But even if it was on the table, I don't think that gives them a seat at the table for the US. Maybe for the reconstruction as part of the peace, but the U.S. seems
right,
to think that that's their money either way. I mean, the oil under Venezuela is apparently American oil, and the money in European banks is American money, and everything is American apparently. And so, because already in the peace plan, they were promising Ukraine that money that they would get and use without even asking the Europeans, without even
right.
consulting them. So, no, I don't think this gives Europe a seat at the table at all. In the US line, they are negotiating bilaterally with Russia and then bilaterally with Ukraine, and then they're going to try
Right.
to bring them in.
Right. I mean, it does seem like that there's a table, but they weren't going to be invited to it, either way, frankly, because the U.S. just doesn't want them in the process. I mean, I did read in the Telegraph that the frozen assets are not in the latest plan. I mean, they're still frozen, and the U.S. can't unilaterally take them,
Right.
and
Which they could have before
which
they.
they could have before. So it is a step, but I don't. Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you that on sort of like a sort of broader level, I don't think this will really impress the Americans, and I'm not sure really what would, but from a substantive level, it is something that gives Ukraine leverage to avoid taking like a really bad deal, like and having to give up Donbass, which
Exactly.
Zelensky has been opposing, and Trump has been clamoring him to do, and the Ukrainians won't do it because it's very heavily fortified, and that would just be like writing their own suicide note.
Yeah,
So
President Zelensky made that point at the press conference yesterday,
yeah,
which went on forever, by the way.
right. Do you think he moved the needle?
Mm, the press conference or his speech
Zelensky
to the
himself. I
crowd?
mean, he showed up to
I
the.
didn't get that impression, and
You didn't get that, okay?
he looked pretty defeated when he walked into that room. I mean, he was
Really? Yeah,
toward the front of the room, and he was not his usual confident self when he walked in, let's say. But he made the point that this isn't because a lot of people in MAGA world are saying. This is unnecessarily continuing the war. Viktor Orban's argument. I saw that Friedrich Merz had a statement when he came in saying that the funding will give Ukraine 2 more years to fight so that we can end the war as quickly as possible. And people
yeah.
were saying that's a contradiction in terms. You're saying you're
Hmm.
continuing the war for 2 years and you want it to end as quickly as possible. But the point is, if you show Russia that you could continue the war for 2 years, then you get a better peace plan. If Russia can see that you're about to run out of money, then you can only accept surrender. And Zelensky didn't say this directly in his press conference yesterday, but it was pretty clear if you read between the lines. If Ukraine didn't get the money by April, they would have to surrender on Russian terms because Russia would know that they are out of money and no one is coming to help them. So that the point that I think all these MAGA people on social media are not getting is that this isn't a blank check to continue the war for 2 years. This is supposed to help Ukraine in the negotiations. Now, you can say, well, it's still Russia has unlimited manpower, unlimited resources to throw at this, and so they don't care. If Ukraine wants to continue the war for 2 years, they'll continue the war for 2 years. Then Ukraine will run out of money. Then, and then they face it, they accept a surrender that they would have accepted 2 years ago, and in the meantime, X number of people have died.
Well, they don't have unlimited resources.
Well, exactly. Yeah, that's what
Yeah,
MAGA seems to think they do.
yeah.
So
They
MAGA
have
seems
their
to think
weaknesses of their own. So
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, the
yeah,
idea is that Russia, a lot of Russia's supposed strength is actually a paper tiger, and
yeah,
if Ukraine has this money and support, then it can face it down. I mean, the theory was for the past 2 years that Russia was waiting for the result of the U.S. election. That
yeah.
if Kamala Harris had won, then they would have moved toward a more equal peace treaty. But they got what they wanted. Donald Trump won. And so they saw that they had the upper hand, that the US support would be ending. And so they were biding their time and waiting. But you're right. They don't actually have unlimited resources, or certainly not unlimited money. And so that's the idea is if you get to a point where Ukraine has that backing, then Russia will back down. But again, that's not the way MAGA seems to view things.
Right. I mean, it does, and I want to wrap up here. I mean, it does seem like, Ukraine, will get to live another day. But, as you say, some of the optics of it are, not great. But uh, it's like it seems like Europe again prevented the worst from happening,
It's
but
classic EU
isn't
style.
really able to do something sort of like bold and innovative to kind of change things. What's your take?
Well, yeah, this is why I say behind the scenes, the optics are terrible, but behind the scenes, one really big thing happened here, which is that Germany agreed to collective debt. We
Yeah,
remember from the Eurozone crisis, this was the thing that made the Eurozone crisis so much worse, that Angela Merkel refused to do this throughout. She never relented on that question. If she had, most economists agree you would have nipped the crisis in the bud and you wouldn't have had the spiraling out of control that we saw from the years 2010 to 2013. So why did Friedrich? Because Friedrich Merz entered that summit saying he wouldn't do it. So he compromised, let's put it nicely, and allowed for it. Now, this did happen once before during COVID. In 2021, the EU finally ended the taboo against Eurobonds, collective debt, to fund the COVID recovery fund, a fund that I think in hindsight we realized we didn't really need. And it's been kind of underutilized. But anyway, that taboo was shattered in 2021. But Berlin, under Schultz, was so insistent that this was a one off, it's an emergency
right, right.
situation only for the pandemic. This will never happen. happen again, the Germans kept saying, the Dutch kept
Yeah.
saying, the Danes kept saying, the Swedes kept saying. Look, it happened again. And it's interesting to me that I didn't hear a peep of objection from the usual Protestant northern suspects, the Dutch, the Danes, the Swedes. And everyone just went along with this. This has big implications for European unity. Like I said at the beginning, if you're a European federalist, this is very
Right.
good news. This is what Mario Draghi called for in the competitiveness report. He said that we need these Eurobonds. Whether these Eurobonds are going to be spent in the best way is an open question, but they're there. And I
Right.
think now no one can say that Eurobonds are not a thing that the EU does. It's now been done twice. So this is now a precedent. We have joint EU debt, and this is going to be the reality going forward. Irrespective of what it means for Ukraine, this is a big step toward European federalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think it shows that, when you're looking down at the abyss, all these sort of precedents kind of go out the window. Well, thank you so much for this talk. And hope you get some sleep.
Thanks.
All
Good to
right.
talk to you.
Take care.
Take care. Bye bye.